Morning. I almost say I would like you to move a little further, so closer to here so that I can see some faces, but I know that you're out there. And I can see there are some Boy Scouts out there too, and I'm delighted that you would come to hear the women speak today. Let me thank Deborah Rosen and also to Sony for being the major sponsors of this Women's Week. But when I was called, about 6 months ago and asked if I would speak today, they said I had to choose a title for my speech. And I thought, well, I probably should choose something that's fairly broad so that when the day comes, I can have a lot of leeway. So I gave it actually a lot of thought and decided in preparing today's comments that I would go back and look at some of my speech notes from when I first married then Senator Pete Wilson. Pete had been the mayor here in San Diego. Many of you probably remember that. But I married him when he was in the Senate and moved to Washington when I was a brand newlywed and a totally novice political spouse. You know, early on, I started getting pointers from more experienced political spouses, and I began keeping a folder of those words of advice, those life lessons that had often been learned by painful experience. And I came across in my folder, I came across an article entitled "The Washington Wife," subtitled "The Perfect Wife." Someone who is bright, sophisticated, speaks a foreign language, waves and smiles, and never utters a political statement other than in support of her husband, while at the same time never saying anything dumb. I think this was written after Jackie Kennedy. Self-control and an abundance of political savvy, but she also had to have a sense of humor so that she could lighten up some very serious situations that often happens in politics. Well, I thought that was a lot to ask. But I did have a mentor at that point, someone with a great sense of humor, and that was Barbara Bush. When her husband was vice president, you may know that the vice president serves as the president of the Senate, and in that role would break any tie votes. So Barbara was the head of the Senate spouses, and she was wonderful about sharing her experiences, the wonderful trips they went on, as well as her words of wisdom. And I specifically remember 3 pieces of advice that she gave me. First one was, don't quit coloring your hair. She said, you know, I became gray very early, in my 30s, and I decided to dye my hair. But she said the dyes weren't very good and my hair was kind of stiff, and I always had these visions of George running his fingers through my hair. She says, not that he did, but I always hoped he would. Plus, she said, I got tired of being mistaken for George's mother. So she said, don't quit coloring your hair. Second piece of advice is, whatever the senator's wife wears is the right thing to wear. Now, you know, we all sort of agonize over what we should wear to this or that. And we were going to an event up in New York, a black tie event, and I called the hostess and I said, you know, how formal is this? And she said, well, this is a long ball gown event. I said, okay. So I schlepped my ball gown up there, only to find that there were women there in business suits, pantsuits, cocktail dresses. It didn't matter. So when I got back, I said to Barbara Bush, how do you know? And she said, just remember, whatever you're wearing is the right thing to wear. And ladies, just remember, whatever you're wearing is the right thing to wear. Don't get too hung up on it. And her third piece of advice was to nurture your close relationships. You'll never regret the time spent with your parents, your spouse, your siblings, your children, or your friends. And I always have taken that to heart. These folders I was talking about, I collected commencement speeches, Ann Landers columns that I like, and newspaper articles. I also like to read books on self-improvement and books on women's friendship. I have a feeling many of you have done the same things, or you probably wouldn't have given up your evenings this week, and especially your Saturday morning, to be at a women's conference. I'm just glad we weren't competing with the Nordstrom's half-yearly sale. Saturday mornings are usually Pete's and my time to do errands. My one rule is to get out early and be home before noon to avoid the crowds. I just wonder why more stores aren't open at 8 a.m., because I'm ready. But Pete and I have started taking a 5-year-old neighbor girl with us on our errands so that her parents can have some free time. Such a cute little girl. And one Saturday Pete takes her, and one Saturday I take her, and last Saturday was my turn. So just as I was merging onto the freeway, I hear this clear treble voice say, "Mrs. Wilson, where are all the bastards?" Well, you might imagine I didn't miss a beat. I said, "Honey, they only come out when the governor's driving." Well, I did set the theme for my comments today about after Sacramento, then what? Well, then what was a huge transition. But then I'd had a huge transition when I married then Senator Pete Wilson and moved to Washington, D.C. just 2 weeks before our wedding. I had been a wife and mother of 2 boys here in San Diego and a community volunteer. But I was not political. Oh, I voted, but that was all. Now, usually people get into politics because they believe in a cause, they want to improve their community, or a candidate catches their fancy. Well, I liked this Mayor Pete Wilson, who was running for the U.S. Senate against Jerry Brown, and so I volunteered at his campaign office, and I showed up and addressed envelopes and answered the phone, and pretty soon I was a surrogate speaker, and here I am. So you see, I believe that volunteerism truly has its rewards. But I remember coming back from our honeymoon and wanting to hide under the bed. This was truly a new way of life, a new city, and a new marriage. I knew no one, and my husband was really, really busy. One thing I learned very quickly was that there was a definite division of labor in our marriage. Pete would decide when we invaded Iraq, and I would do everything else. Now, ladies, I have a feeling a lot of you can relate to that. Actually, I did love our life, or most of our life. One day when the press was being particularly hard on Pete, I remember turning to him and saying, "I don't know why you do what you do." And he said, "Because I feel I make a difference. You know, that was enough for me, and I never said that again." But of course, I wanted to make a difference too. And as a senator's wife, I had an opportunity to do something significant. I just didn't know what that would be. At the same time, I was learning some practical aspects of being a political spouse. I learned that when the choice was between being right and being pleasant, to choose pleasant. I learned to wear comfortable shoes, to put my name tag high on my right shoulder, and to introduce myself again for those who only recognized me when I was standing next to Pete. In fact, there's a terrific friend here today whose son had been one of our interns, and who introduces herself every time she sees me. And frankly, I'm really grateful, because if someone is out of context, you can't expect that you're going to necessarily remember their names. But fortunately, I really like people, and I'm self-motivated and have an active curiosity and wanted to get involved in Washington. There were lots of opportunities, and fortunately, I had had excellent training through the Junior League of San Diego, whose sole mission is to train volunteers. Let me just grab a sip of water here. When I was a member of the League, I had served as a moderator of a weekly KPBS radio show focusing on education. All the potential moderators were required to read one book by Barbara Walters. It's called How to Talk to Practically Anybody About Practically Anything. I still have it on my bookshelf, and although I haven't read it in a long time, every once in a while, when I find my dinner partner is really hard to crack, I think about it. In fact, recently, I was at a dinner celebrating the groundbreaking of a building at Caltech, and I was seated next to the construction manager, who was a very nice gentleman. But after we'd sort of gotten through any comments or questions that I had about the construction, I finally said, "So when you're not building buildings, what do you like to do?" And he turned to me and he said, "I'm a competitive ballroom dancer." Well, you could have knocked me over, truly. But it did open up a lot of other avenues of conversation about dancing with the stars and where do you buy your dance shoes and where do you take ballroom dancing lessons. But who knew what an interesting conversation that was going to be. But the best advice I had before moving to Washington was to keep your old friends. They knew you before you were anybody, and they'll still be your friends when you're not anybody. And I took that advice very seriously and still cherish my friends in San Diego. I still have my cooking club group of 44 years and my showbiz performing group of 36 years. And I'm very grateful for their friendships.